So spiritual trauma is affecting all of our lives.
Yeah.
Maybe we should back up and define some terms first.
Yeah.
Because I've gotten myself in trouble when I haven't defined terms. And so now I'm trying to understand where you're coming from.
Yeah. I have a few definitions that I like to use.
Yeah. We should probably define what you mean by trauma. And we should probably define what you mean by spiritual.
Mm-hmm. So I'm pulling up the definition for spirituality first. So one of the things I talk about Brene Brown a lot and reference her work. She is a PhD in social work, has a couple TED Talks, several books out. And in one of her books, she defines what spirituality is. And I vibe pretty hard with her definition. So she defines spirituality as this. Spirituality is recognizing and celebrating that we are all inextricably connected to each other by a power greater than all of us.
We're all connected to each other by a power greater than all of us.
Yep.
Gotcha.
And it continues.
Oh, sorry.
And that connection to that power and one another is grounded in love and compassion. Practicing spirituality brings a sense of perspective, meaning, and purpose to our lives.
Say that second part again so I can understand it.
Yeah. Practicing spirituality brings a sense of perspective, meaning, and purpose to our lives.
Gotcha. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
And then for trauma, what are we talking about?
There are so trauma is a pretty hot button topic nowadays. And it has been defined extensively and then in very easy, small, easy to understand and grapple with terms. And so for me, I think trauma is when there's so many different ways to go.
I think it would be a good, a way that we could, just so we know we're talking about the same thing.
Yeah. So trauma is when our brains have been hurt, to put it in an easy to understand way, and we are still grappling with the experience of something that might have happened to us. And so an example there could go in multiple different directions would be when someone's experiencing a moment of PTSD. So they had a moment in their past where they have been, quote, traumatized. And so they experience something that is really detrimental to their safety. And what happens in that moment is they are continuing to experience that moment after the fact in moments that, quote, trigger a response and trigger the memory.
So we're talking about trauma. You're talking about major trauma, like a heightened negative experiences that causes flashbacks, sleeplessness.
Sure. And I think there's big T trauma.
Yeah.
As in capital T, and then there's little t trauma. And little t trauma is what happens over time. So little t trauma might be if a child is growing up with a neglectful parent. And over time, that one instance is, not that big of a deal, if you will. But over time, when it happens again and again and again, that repeated little t trauma becomes a big T. And then there's the big T where someone goes and experiences a moment of, physical abuse or sexual abuse or spiritual abuse.
Are we talking about both big T and
I think it's both. I think there are definitely elements of both that are important to consider when we're thinking about it. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you for doing that. That helps when we're talking about it. Sometimes we'll get in the middle of a conversation like, are we talking about the same thing? And I've learned my lesson.
Well, and I think that I probably should have prepared a definition to go off of. And there's so many to choose from, and is figuring out which one is best applicable. But yeah, I think for getting the conversation started, that will provide at least some context.
Thank you.
Yeah.
On a scale from 1 to 7, how confident are you that your belief is true?
Ooh. 5?
Okay. More confident than not.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
I assume 7 is confident and 1 is not confident. Yeah.
7 is right. 7 is way complete confidence, and 1 would be no confidence.
Yeah. I feel good about 5.
Also, on a scale from 1 to 7, how important is it for you to believe in things that are true and real?
Also a 5.
Interesting.
Yeah.
5. So, what you believe, you're fairly confident, not extremely confident, but fairly confident what you believe is true. And even if it's not true, I think you're saying you're okay with it.
So, yes. And the reason is, specifically with this belief, I believe that the world would be a better place if we treated it as if it were true.
Okay. Right. And we're talking about the belief being true or false, and not, just so I understand, not whether it should be true.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just making sure. Okay. We'll get more into that in a bit, because 5 and a 5, that's very interesting, and I have to think that through.
Not your normal answer.
Actually, no. Usually people are higher up on the scale, and maybe not so much the confidence level, but usually they would be higher up on a truth scale. But that is not making a judgment at all. That's just me experiencing something novel. How do you know your belief is true?
It's a great question. I like to read, and I did not always like reading. But after college, funnily enough, I started reading a lot, and I came across Brene Brown's work when I was working at summer camp in about 11 years ago, and it just kind of opened my world up into this whole new conversation around what the world is collectively engaging with. And for me, it seems like the world at large is, especially my community. And so I've traveled, but I have not spent extensive time in other countries. So I mean, when I say the world, I'm a lot of that is anecdotal evidence and or some of those things. But certainly my world, if not the world, is grappling with a lot of shame and a lot of guilt and a lot of really difficult emotional experiences because of the way that our world is grappling with the racism, the pandemic that we're in, the mass terrorist attacks that have been happening all over the world. Like all of these things that are sparking conversations are cultivating a culture of what I believe to be is centered around grappling with our shame and not doing it very well. And so when I see these things that are happening and I relate them to how I'm experiencing those things in my life, I feel like I am not quite so alone because I see that I'm not the only one experiencing these things. And so grappling with the collective trauma that is happening around the country, the United States right now, around Black Lives Matter, around the pandemic, around so many things that are occurring, it seems as though I'm just more and more seeing evidence that we are in crisis management. And so that leads me to believe what I believe. I'm seeing more and more evidence of it, and not much in the sense of how we're handling it.
Okay. You put a lot. You put a lot on the plate. So let me let me try to understand fundamentally why you believe the belief. And I think you mentioned a few things.
Mm-hmm.
One is a book that you
several. Yeah.
You mentioned one particular author, Brown.
Yep.
And another reason why you believe the belief is personal experience of what you're seeing around you.
Yep.
And I think you also related it to maybe the personal experience of others. I'm not quite sure.
Yeah. So I think there is data to suggest that there are others who are experiencing similar things.
Data.
Yeah.
Okay. Of all those reasons, and it doesn't have to be an either or thing, but when you think about how you know that belief is true, what's the main reason you would use in your mind?
I think that the number one thing that has led me to this would be, well, that's so hard. And here's why it's difficult is because they all contribute to one another. So I think that the literature that I read helps me grapple with my own personal experience. Mm-hmm. And I think it helps me contextualize and understand the data that I'm receiving, and all vice versa. And so I think they all talk to each other. But if I had to pick one, I think that I am most probably slanted and swayed by my own personal experience.
Okay. And again, it's not an either or thing, but it helps me know fundamentally why you might believe something.
Yeah, I know. I don't know how familiar you are with personality profiles, but like I always think about this when I go back to like INFJ or like Enneagram 1 and all these different personality profiles. I'm very instinctual, and that's something that I've had to grapple with. And because instincts aren't always correct, sometimes our brains trick us, but I have relied on and lived with my instincts for a while, and they have served me well. And so in this case, it may not, but in this case, or in general, I have felt served well by that personal experience.
So when we're talking about personal experience, we're talking about personal experience of what you've seen or been through, and also personal experience of the way you function as you have these impressions, these hunches, these feelings of what is true.
Yes.
Is that correct?
That's also true. Yeah.
And you might have described it in slightly different terms, but I'm trying to encapsulate it the best I can. And that's another way how you know that it is true. So we're talking about personal experience. What do we mean? Is it things that you've seen on television, things you've experienced yourself, things that you've seen your friends experience, and you're talking about hunches or impressions how do you know what you know here?
So thinking about the belief of, we are collectively grappling with spiritual trauma.
Yeah.
I think that one, if I go back to my personal history of what spiritual trauma has looked like for me, and one way that I could do that is thinking about, so what does it look like to be I have 6 siblings. And when I was younger, I used to dress up and I used to paint my nails, and I used to like wear a tutu every now and then. And then when I did, I would get ridiculed by my siblings for being gay or coming across that way or being perceived that way. And at the time, I didn't identify as gay. But when I get older and I become more and more comfortable, like grappling with my shame from being called a name that I didn't identify with, and then knowing that I was being put down by my siblings, who theoretically family, unconditional love, all that jazz, which I don't necessarily subscribe to, but going through that was an experience. And now that is a familial experience. Now, if you put that in the context of a church,
I see.
Right? All of a sudden, what you have is someone who is gatekeeping what may or may not be heaven for you based off of an identity that others are putting onto you, that you are subscribing to, and that's something that you're owning. And then all of a sudden, it's like, if I am who I am not, I don't belong here. And that's traumatic.
So we're talking about the kind of trauma we're talking about. We're talking about familial trauma and church trauma, where how you feel and how you act is frowned upon. And
I would say it's more than frowned upon. I would say it's condemned.
It's condemned. And there's trauma inflicted upon you because of who you are.
Yeah. Well, if you subscribe to the belief that if you're going to the church, and this applies not just to Christianity, this applies to any spirituality that you belong to, but using the Christian church is a very low-hanging fruit, if you will. If you subscribe to the belief that, God loves you, but doesn't love you if you are gay, that is one example of how that is incredibly traumatic. Because literally, so the shame is defined as the fear of being unlovable.
Okay.
Right. And so, and it's not only like, it's described as like the master emotion, because when you experience it, it almost always covers up and masks your other ones because it's so powerful and controlling.
Yeah.
And so what happens is when you experience that kind of shame, and if I were to ask you, for instance, when you can think of a time, and I'm not trying to walk you into a moment of shame for you, but when you think about the moments where you have reacted and you felt shame, what your body does.
Yeah. Kind of withdraws and tightens. And
those descriptions. Yeah. If I were to ask someone else, what are the symptoms, what are the bodily affects of experiencing a trauma?
Yeah.
They would say the same things.
Yeah.
So our brain interprets shame as trauma.
That's what you're saying. Okay. And I want to understand your two terms of trauma and spiritual.
Yeah.
Better. If Johnny was sitting next to you and he fundamentally had the same belief that you did, but the only difference was, as Johnny said, that all this was going on in the world and what you've experienced has caused spiritual anxiety.
Sure.
Are we talking about the same thing? Or are we talking about something different?
I think that's different.
Okay.
I would describe anxiety differently than I would this. Because I think that spirituality is something that's really hard, and it's like there's a reason that it's hard to quantify like how spiritual one person is, or whether like someone who subscribes to a certain belief subscribes to even someone who's sitting next to them in the pews or at the mosque or in whatever container that is for you. And so,
and that does bring me to the second question. If Johnny then says, okay, trauma, and then what if he says these sorts of things called psychological trauma?
Mm-hmm.
Are we saying the same thing as spiritual trauma or something different?
Yeah, so I think spiritual trauma, to put that in its own umbrella term, is trauma that is inflicted by or caused by or experienced in a spiritual context.
Okay. Spiritual trauma occurs within a spiritual context, and psychological trauma occurs within a psychological context.
And those can overlap. And so I think that you can have psychological trauma, physical trauma in a church, right? And if you are in that spiritual space where that's something you're subscribing to, that can then therefore become a spiritual trauma as well.
What is it about the space that causes something to be a spiritual trauma versus a psychological trauma, do you think?
The person who's experiencing its beliefs. So if someone is in a church and they believe that that church is hallowed ground, then that can be something that is a spiritual experience for them. If I am not Christian, go into a church and something happens to me, that's not necessarily going to be a spiritual experience for me. It could be, but not necessarily.
Okay. I'm trying to understand. If I had something happen to me at the gym and something, someone traumatized me or shamed me, would I be able to, this is not belittling the belief, this is really to understand.
Sure.
Would I be able to call that a sports trauma, or I'm trying to understand.
So spirituality is interesting because what's spiritual for me and spiritual for you can be different. And so spirituality for a lot of people is sitting on a boat and fishing on the lake.
Okay.
Right? And that's the most spiritual experience that they can think of. And for some people, it is inflicted by people of power in an institutional religion. Right? And so like there's a difference between the institutional spirituality and the spirituality that is within each of us, that we are, whether or not we subscribe to that or not.
What if we just went ahead and said that there are only spiritual traumas and no psychological traumas? What if we just called everything spiritual traumas? Can we do that and just no?
I don't know that we could, because I hesitate to say always or never, but I don't think so. Because if someone who is, I think of the Me Too movement in this case as an example, if someone who is sexually abused and that is a night of fun for them, and then it turns into a night of terror because of that abuse, that's not a spiritual experience. It could be, if that's their mindset when they're entering that space, right?
Now the trauma, and this is why I'm glad that I talked to you about what you mean by spiritual in the beginning. When we talked about if someone who has a terrible sexual experience, violence, something terrible happened to them, and it's a spiritual trauma. So we're saying that trauma has something to do with our relationship to others through a higher power. Is that correct?
Can you repeat that one more time?
Well, to use your definition of spiritual, when something terrible happens in a spiritual space, what we're saying is that terrible thing that happened is something that a negative connection that we've had with another person through a higher power? No, I'm sorry.
No, I think
because I'm using your definition of spirituality, and your definition of spirituality, I think, is a connection with others through a higher power in some sense. And so we're talking about a spiritual trauma. We're talking about two people having an intense negative reaction, negative experience with each other through a higher power.
Yeah. So, and I think that that's not true, because it's not necessarily through the higher power. However, it can be, right? Especially if that's what you are believing. And so, like, it's one of those things where another, like, extreme way to put it is if someone is raised in a cult, for instance, and they are raised believing that when they do X, Y, or Z, that God will punish them. God being whatever God may be in that situation.
Okay.
And then they do that thing, and then in their minds they believe that God is punishing them. Then that's a spiritual trauma with that higher power, and it's all happening in that person. No one else is aware unless they're sharing it, right? And so when it's between two people, and I think that's what makes this topic so interesting or potentially nebulous, is that this metastasizes and even what's the word, mutates depending upon each individual's personal beliefs, which is what's really interesting, because what may traumatize me may not, the same experience may have no effect on you. It might be embarrassing for you. It might be humiliating. It might be shaming. It might be guilt. Like it sparked guilt, but trauma is not the same for everyone, and neither is spirituality. And so when you have two things that, when they're experienced entirely uniquely between people, defining spiritual trauma becomes something that also mutates and changes based off whomever is experiencing it at the time. I don't know. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
I'm trying to understand. I am. So it seems that someone can experience something as being in a spiritual trauma. And I think what you're telling me is another person could experience that exact same thing and that not be a spiritual trauma.
Correct. And it could be a trauma, but it might not be a spiritual trauma. It could be, in the same way, a spiritual experience, but not traumatic.
If the same event can be a spiritual trauma and not a spiritual trauma, you're telling me the difference is, I'm really trying to understand, the difference is how the person perceives the trauma.
Precisely.
As it being spiritual or not spiritual.
It's all in the perception of the person who's owning whatever is occurring at the time. Yes.
So if I experience a spiritual trauma, and the reason why I experience a spiritual trauma is because my sense of spiritualism. And if I didn't have that sense of spiritualism, then I wouldn't experience that sense of spiritual trauma.
Sometimes, yes.
How do we know then that that concept then is a thing? If someone can have one experience of that being a spiritual trauma and that very same experience and it not being a spiritual trauma, how do we know that when someone does say it's a spiritual trauma, that it's a spiritual trauma, that that's a thing? How do we know that?
That's a good, interesting question. If I were to put that in the context of like a racist comment, and if I were to, as a white male, to say something that a black male perceives to be racist, but another black male says that's not racist, does it cease to become racist? And that's the question, right? It's all in who's interpreting and who's doing that. But if they experience it that way, then whose responsibility is it to make that, like, to navigate whether it was harmful or not, right?
So if I experience something, if Johnny experiences a thing, how does that relate to that thing being true and real? If someone, I could experience a lot of things and they may be true, they may not be true, and we may not ever be able to know, but does the act of experiencing make that thing real?
So
does the act of experiencing a spiritual trauma make a spiritual trauma real?
There's a quote from Harry Potter where Harry asks at the end of a book, is this real or is this happening inside my head? And Dumbledore responds with, of course it's all happening inside your head. But why would that make it not real? And I'm paraphrasing. That's not necessarily the exact quote, but when things occur within us, whether they are unique or whether they are something that can be categorically identified as something that is predictable, right? And I mean, is it like, in a way you could ask, like, is blue blue? Yeah. Right? And so, but it's one of the I didn't finish that original thought. I'm tangenting. Sorry. One of the things that I appreciate about like there's numbers data, but there's also qualitative data.
Yeah.
And qualitative research uses qualitative data. Duh. And what it does is it looks for what is called I'm forgetting what it's called.
Are you saying that the spiritual is a qualitative sense and not a
I'm saying that qualitative data is just as useful and necessary for defining and understanding our experiences as any sort of thing that might be in the DSM, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Health or Mental Illness. But even then, if we look at the DSM, there's been so many flaws over time because things have been added and removed because as we grow and we learn and more and we're able to quantify. And so
the DSM we could maybe describe as a nomenclature to describing what happens in the world, what is true about the world, but whether those categories really truly exist as this is bipolar, this is schizophrenia, this is something else, that might be a harder thing to know.
And I think what's important is that I believe that we are collectively doing the best that we can with the knowledge that we have, which asserts also that we don't have all the knowledge in the world that can or will exist. And our best isn't necessarily the cream of the crop, right?
So are we saying that the spiritual is a perception of something that is real, or that is real? That is something that is real?
Depends on who you ask. Like, I think if you ask
I'm asking you.
Yeah. For me, spirituality, it exists. Like I'm 7 on that. Very confident.
Okay.
But I think, and I also am a 7 on trauma exists.
Okay.
Right. And what is, I think, difficult to navigate with it is based off of the unique experiences of people and the interpretations. But I think we have to choose.
So it exists, yet people interpret it differently.
Yes.
Thought experiment?
Let's try.
Okay. I have these boxes of Mentos here.
All right.
I believe that there are an even number of Mentos in this box.
Okay.
I believe it. I believe that's a real thing. People may perceive them differently or whatever. Regardless, I believe that is a fact, an objective fact about the world, that there's an even number of Mentos.
Okay.
I am sitting next to Johnny, and Johnny believes that there's an odd number of Mentos in this box. Do we both have true beliefs that this is a real thing, or is one of us correct and one of us not correct? I'm just trying to understand how you see the world in a bigger sense.
Sure. I think I think believing is valid, but as soon as you're presented with information that tells you otherwise, I think we need to be willing to grapple and understand with the fact that if I believe there's an odd number of Mentos and we end up counting them and I learn that there's an even number, it's not saying, nope, there was an odd number. It's saying, okay, I've come into contact with new information and I'm willing to make a change.
Gotcha. So we both believe something that may or may not be true, and you're saying there's a test. And if I believe there's an even, Johnny believes there's an odd.
Yep.
There's a test that we can do.
Yes.
And then we have an answer.
Sure.
Hopefully. If I believe that the spirituality is, as you defined it, if I believe that it's a thing, it's true, objectively true, and I'm sitting next to Johnny.
Yeah.
And Johnny doesn't believe that that is an objectively true thing.
Mm-hmm.
What could we do at that point
to
discover what is true?
Okay, what is the test to figure out whether it is true?
Sure.
So I think that's interesting because what that experiment does, is it puts Johnny's experience and your experience on the same playing field.
Okay.
And so for a third party trying to determine whether spirituality is real based off of you and Johnny, that's like almost like, how would you prove that based off of you and Johnny, right? What is something that is true to you and something that is true to Johnny, right? That is not a physical thing that you can count or test or do. How do you, like, it's like saying, how do you test for God? And theologians have been trying to do that for years, right? And so you can't prove that God exists. You also cannot prove that God does not exist, right? And so that's where the faith element comes in, right? So spirituality separated from faith. Spirituality is belief that we are all connected to one another through some sort of belief that there is something greater than all of us, whether that's God or not.
I didn't want you to go too far. I just wanted to, before I could just understand what you're saying, that the difference between a test for the Mentos and the test between my belief, let's say, and Johnny's belief, is that there's an element of faith.
Yeah, I jumped quickly from that.
No, I just want to know what you're saying. And by faith, we mean
belief in something that cannot be proven to exist, right?
Are you saying faith is belief without the evidence of that belief being true? Or are you saying something different?
That's a good question. This is where it gets nebulous. So being spiritual and having spirituality is your subscription to that there is something greater to all of us, whether that be a virtue, like, for instance, love. I believe love is greater than I am. And therefore, I think that love connects all of us, right? And so we are connected by love. So if I were to put that as an example, right, I would then have to be that belief. And then there is the faith element, which is you could potentially swap belief and faith, right? But what happens is faith is that element of you don't know, but you believe it anyway.
You believe something that you don't know. You believe something that you don't know. I'm trying to understand.
Yeah.
How do we know something that we don't know?
Yeah. So I am currently in divinity school trying to suss that out myself. Just to be frank, do not subscribe to any particular religion. And so when I think about someone who has a manual, whether that be the Torah, the Bible, the Quran, that has this, text that they are subscribing to that is sacred. And when you are told from a very young age that every word of that is true,
mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
Even when it has been like several of the instances and things that have happened have been proven that this cannot happen. Like no one can do this, right? And yet people still believe it.
Yeah.
And so you can believe something that isn't true. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of judgment around that in the world. And so, and yet there's a vast majority of people in the world who subscribe to religion and believe things that aren't necessarily able to be proven.
Yeah. And I see where you're coming from. I think you're saying that people have beliefs that are not true.
That are not able to be proven whether they are true or not. I'm not saying they are true or not true, because I don't know.
People have beliefs that may be true, and they may not be true.
Mm-hmm.
I think I see where you're coming from. Some beliefs are true.
Yeah.
And some are not true. And I may go out on a limb and say that there are probably more false beliefs, I would say, than true beliefs. I'm just going on a limb on saying
I'd go on that limb.
Yeah.
I wouldn't bet on it. Like I would bet on it, but I wouldn't like bet everything.
Okay.
You know? Well, it reminds me of Schrodinger's cat, right? There's a cat in a box. Someone says it's dead, someone says it's alive, right? It is both alive and dead until proven otherwise, until you open the box.
Would that go?
And it applies to your Mentos, right? There is both an odd number and a negative number in that until you open it and figure it out.
So that's helpful. So in the case of the Mentos, there are an even number of Mentos in this box, and then there are an odd number of Mentos in this box, and both are true until we count them.
Yes. That is I'm not like super well versed on the entire theory around that, but that is the base of that.
Yeah. I'm trying to take that idea to its logical conclusion. I'm trying to maybe think that if there can be an even or odd number of Mentos in this box, and then I would think that then spirituality could be true, or the spiritual as you describe it could be true or could not be true, or there could be a car sitting out there or not be a car sitting out there. And I'm thinking what you're telling me is that everything really is true and everything really is simultaneously not true.
Well, and I would say that your experience based off your belief is valid, whether that belief is true or not.
Say it again.
Your belief.
Mm-hmm.
Wait, what did I say? Your experience of your belief.
My experience of my belief.
Whether that belief is true or not is valid.
My experience of my belief. Are we saying my belief of my belief?
No, your experience.
My experience.
So when your belief, let's say, let's translate this to vaccines. If you are interested and you believe that this COVID vaccine, right, is beneficial, you believe it is going to help prevent you from getting COVID. And then there is someone who is simultaneously saying, I do not believe those things.
Yeah.
Your experience in your mind, the things that you're thinking about that belief, the way that that belief is affecting your body, the way that that belief is affecting your relationships, that experience is valid regardless of whether the belief is true or not.
I think I see where you're coming from. And more towards the beginning of the conversation, I think we were talking about not so much whether a belief is valid in the sense that, yes, I believe it, or it's my experience of it being true, that I think we're trying to talk about it more whether it is true. And for example, your example of the vaccines, if I believe that a certain vaccine will work, and Johnny is sitting next to me and Johnny believes that same vaccine won't work, that I won't get COVID if I believe that vaccine works, and he believes that it doesn't work. So if he gets vaccine, then he'll just would get COVID because he didn't believe. Does my belief about the vaccine have anything to do with the truth of whether the vaccine works?
I don't know if there's enough data to tell us that. and I think specifically with the vaccine, I don't know, but
it sounds like that there's a test.
Well,
maybe.
Well,
I mean, what if we gave like 2,000 people vaccines, and some believe that it would stop them from getting COVID, and and the other half believe that it wouldn't.
Yep.
I would imagine, and tell me, I mean, I'm coming up with a test, and if I'm coming up with an incorrect test, let me know. I would imagine by the end of the test, we would maybe get closer to an objective truth about that question.
Sure. But what we're testing is that vaccine, right? What we're testing is that specific vaccine. And what is really interesting about that is the people on both sides will develop and cultivate and write stories in their minds that will often corroborate their own beliefs. And so there's this unconscionable like bias that we all bring to the table. And like the short answer is yes, we can test and prove whether there is an efficacy to this vaccine.
Yeah.
Right. And we can say quantifiably that it is at least beneficial to some degree or not.
Yeah.
And so we can, and specifically if we're talking about COVID, we can look at a vaccinated COVID patient and an unvaccinated COVID patient and look at the two compared x-rays and see that one's going to be way worse off. Right. That being said, the person who, and this is not always going to be true, but oftentimes what happens is someone who is grounded in a belief and unwilling to take in new information will then continue to be like, well, it would have been worse if I had gotten the vaccine, and they're not willing to listen to the data. Right. And so.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. I do. I think I see where it's coming from, that where the lens I have about how I interpret information will really affect whether I see that information as true or not. And I think with a vaccine example, I think that's why in a scientific example, what the person thinks about it in that study, if it was properly designed, would be irrelevant in the sense that there is a test, and that same test is true for everybody, regardless of what they believe.
Yeah. There's a scientific method that's involved.
There's a method, and there's a way to root out those biases.
Correct.
If someone thinks that the COVID would have been worse if they got this or that, they might not even know if they got the vaccine or not.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? The scientists might not even know whether they got the vaccine or not.
Did they get the placebo or did they get the vaccine?
Nobody knows.
Yeah.
Until the very end when they unblind the studies.
Yep.
And so I'm thinking that could be a test in that.
Sure.
Right.
And they've done a ton of tests around prayer and whether the efficacy of prayer, right? And so does prayer help someone when they have cancer? They've done those tests. There's been a lot of money poured into things along those lines. And I say that as an example because that's often associated with spirituality.
Yeah.
But it's one of those things where when it comes to the test for other things like Mentos, if you take the Mento and you like destroy it, no one can ever count it. It is it will always be unknown, right? So you have the Mentos bottle.
Okay.
Odd or even.
Yeah.
And then Mentos bottle is gone. You'll never know.
Oh, you mean gone like put in another room, or gone
as in like it's destroyed, it's thrown out, and you no longer have it to count. You'll never know.
So if we, in the case of the Mentos bottle, Mentos box, if we gave this box to somebody, and they took that box unbeknownst to us to the other room and destroyed that box.
Yep.
What would there you're saying that there wouldn't be an objective answer to that question?
I'm saying that whether you believe it to be odd or whether you believe it to be even may or may not be beside the point, but your experience of you thinking it odd or thinking it even is still going to be with you, and it's going to affect you, right? And so when it comes to, for instance, a traumatic incident where they both experience the same thing, this person said, Johnny says it's not traumatic.
Yeah.
Susie says it is.
I'm trying to understand it in terms of your belief of a spiritual trauma. And we were defining what trauma meant, and then we're trying to define what a spiritual trauma was as to something else.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how we got here. And I'm trying to understand how we know what we know. I want to know how we could describe it to ourselves.
The reason I brought up qualitative research earlier is that when you can begin to predict how people will respond when they have experienced X, Y, or Z, that becomes a predictable thing.
Okay.
And so there are enough people and enough pieces of data that suggests that they have experienced trauma in spiritual settings.
Yeah.
And there is a lot of data as to how those people have grappled with it. Now, just because I am sitting over here and see that that wasn't traumatizing for me, right? That's an odd number of Mentos for me. Doesn't mean that this person's experience is no longer valid, right?
Yeah, and I want to make sure we separate the experience.
Well, and I think that's what's so interesting about spiritual trauma is the experience and the knowing are tied to one another.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Go on.
I think the experience and the knowing are tied to one another because in order to experience this spirituality, which is entirely inside of you and unique, and you might be part of a community that you prescribe to that has similar beliefs, right? But as a general rule, this is something that is me focused, right? It is unique. And so when that is tied to a trauma, like an incident that is also interpreted based off of a trauma, which is interpreted, it becomes this thing that it's my knowing and understanding of my spirituality or not knowing it and grappling with it and not like being able to wrap my head around it and then experiencing in that context creates the problem.
I think I see where you're coming from. It's
very nebulous.
Let's talk. Maybe this will help me. And thank you for hanging in there with me.
Thanks for hanging in there with me.
Johnny. We're going to change Johnny's belief again.
We're going to
try. Johnny, let's say, has the exact same belief as you in the sense that there are these harms in the sense that there are these harms that cause traumas, just in a very basic sense.
Sure.
And let's say Johnny, for whatever reason, denies up and down. He says, well, you know what? Is the spiritual, as you define it, as this higher power that connects us, he says, I don't think that's the thing. I don't believe it. And I think, I can explain how these traumatic things can happen and how we respond to them completely without that concept of the spiritual.
Mm-hmm.
Would we say that his belief is correct?
It could be.
Okay.
And so I think there's two things there. I think one absolutely could be true. Like for him, no, it's not.
For him.
Yes.
So the spiritual could be true for one person and not true for another person.
Absolutely.
How do we know things that are true for one person and not true for another person? How do we know that that is a real thing, that it exists, that it's real? How do we know that?
You know, I'm not sure that I can answer that, and I don't know that if I'm a processor, so it usually takes me time to think about things.
Please take your time. Take your time.
But I just don't know.
Yeah, and these are difficult questions for sure.
Let me see if I can rephrase the question back at you, and that way I know I'm answering the right question.
Please.
Is that fair?
Please.
So I'm hearing that Johnny,
yeah,
and Susie believe the same thing, like spiritually speaking.
Sure. Well, Johnny and Susie believe in the concept of that there's these events out there that cause, these are traumatic events and cause trauma with people.
So they believe that trauma exists.
Yeah, they believe that trauma exists, and people have traumatic experiences, and some of these big T traumas and some of these small T traumas, they're all the same, except for one small difference. Johnny says, "Yeah, I believe it, but there is no the spiritual. I don't know what that means, and I know you defined it as kind of a higher power sort of thing that connects us all, but I don't really think that's necessary for this to work. That this works fine without that concept."
Yeah.
And if we wanted to know,
so that's helpful. So I think the main conversation is like trauma, period, exists. And then whether we attach the label of spirituality to it is what we're trying to parse out, right? And so what merits something getting that spiritual label?
Why don't we just stop at trauma? Why do we need to go to spiritual trauma?
So why do we need to go to physical trauma? Why do we need to go to sexual trauma? Why do we need to go to...
If someone experiences physical or sexual trauma, would there, in that experience, let's say physical trauma,
be physical evidence?
Well, I'm thinking that maybe in that case, yeah, maybe there would be a way to know what we're talking about. I'm just trying to understand how we know.
Well, and I think that that's something that we know because we ask. We know because the data, the qualitative data that the person who's experienced it has given us, we listen and we believe, right? And so when someone tells me that they were abused, we believe it. Now, the police might need to like corroborate and say, hey, can you show me XYZ bruise? But here's the problem. If there's no evidence, right, then... And so someone...
And when Johnny experiences trauma...
Yeah.
And there's... there's no evidence, it's fine, and Johnny says, I experienced trauma, and it's trauma.
Mm-hmm.
There's not spiritual trauma. And thinking about that, maybe what we should do at that point is step back even further. And you're defining spirituality as connected through a higher power. Maybe we should step back even further and find out what you mean there. And what do you mean,
higher power? What
do you mean by connected by higher power? Maybe that will help.
So by a power that is greater than us.
How do you...
right?
Yeah, tell me.
And so for some people, that is God. For others, it might be a value. It might be whatever that is for each person, right? And it's different. What connects us, right, might be different for me than it is for you. And that's where it gets murky, right? It's, again, dependent upon the unique perspective of what spirituality means. But this is so good. This is good for me. This is good to know and be able to articulate. So I'm glad we're having this conversation. I can think of like 5 people that would be able to answer this question better than I would. So I think answering the question of what is that higher power is dependent upon the person who is subscribing to whatever that power might be, right? And I think that's what gets dicey. When I speak about spiritual trauma at large, like general spiritual trauma, it is often associated with harms directly from beliefs that come from your religion, right? This becomes even more difficult to parse out when we are outside of these institutional religions, which is why this conversation I think is so in the weeds.
Well, okay, this is helpful to me. If I say church related trauma
Yes.
and spiritual trauma, am I saying the same thing?
Rectangles and squares. So a rectangle is a square, but a rectangle is not a square, but a square is a rectangle, right?
What in the Venn diagram, which fits in where?
Yeah. So I think that if you are religious and you are a church going person, that is a place of spirituality for you, and therefore religion and that whole experience, everything you experience within Christianity is therefore tagged spiritual.
Let me ask you this.
Okay.
Can I not be spiritual and have a spiritual trauma?
I don't think you can. Unless you were, right? And then you stopped being spiritual because of it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Beliefs change.
Yeah, I'm just trying to understand. I'm really trying to understand. I'm just trying to understand when we're talking about spiritual, and then we started talking about faith and knowing things that we don't have evidence of that knowledge. And I'm really trying to understand how you know what you know. I'm a bit of a block.
I think that might be the hitch, is that I believe that when I believe this knowledge, I believe that when I believe this knowledge, I am doing the world a greater service by helping address it than if I didn't believe it. So, when I believe that spiritual trauma exists, and that it is affecting all of us, I am going to begin addressing it and actively feeling accountable and responsible for making changes so that we can not be collectively grappling with trauma.
I believe that spiritual trauma exists, and therefore it's going to help me address spiritual trauma.
Yes.
Okay. That statement confuses me a little bit.
Mm-hmm. So I also believe that trauma exists, period, regardless of the attachment to what it exists, right?
Right. And I just, because you mentioned very specifically spiritual trauma, and I'm just trying to understand. Yeah.
And so when I am working through and parsing out this idea that spiritual trauma exists, I am therefore going to act accordingly. And so I am not going to, when I am in a spiritual conversation, when I am counseling people, when I am working with people in a spiritual context, when I am critically evaluating theologies that are cultivating and shaping the world, like Christianity is, and Islam and Judaism, I'm going to critically assess whether those things are having a traumatic influence on its population.
Is there anything out there in the world that you would be able to experience, something that I know personal experience seems to be a fundamental way you know this? Is there anything that could happen in the world that would make you more confident in the belief? You're at a 5. How could we get you to a 7? What would make you even more confident that your belief, as stated, is true? To a 5.5 even, to a 6.
just to make sure that I'm still honing in on the belief we started on.
Yes, please. That's a good point. That's a great point. Let's talk about that.
That
we're talking about the same belief.
So that we are all either have experienced, or have been affected by spiritual trauma.
What would make you more confident in that belief? That we are all experiencing spiritual trauma.
Well, I don't know that I would ever say 7. Okay. Just because I don't think I'd say that with a lot of things. But I think I'm actively pursuing that question with my schooling. That's literally what I'm trying to study and parse out. Is I am going to school to learn about not only trauma, but also spiritual trauma and spirituality, and how those all things are connected.
So learning more about trauma, learning more about spirituality will make spirituality more true to you, and the belief more true to you?
I don't know that it will make spirituality more true for me. Sorry. I think it will make that belief more true.
So,
meaning that I will...
Learning more about your belief will make your belief more true.
Let me rephrase. Okay, I'm sorry. Learning information that confirms, right? Like, like that if I'm gonna, like, I might go into this learning and realize that, like, oh, nope, right? This is telling me that this is a hoax. Don't think that's going to happen.
So learning, confirming information will help you
become more confident. So doing research, learning more from valid resources would boost that for me.
And by valid resources, we mean
reputable research.
And by reputable research, we mean just trying to understand. I just want to know what you mean.
Research that has been done by someone who has had the work, not validated is not the word, confirmed is not the word, but it has become predictable, and the theories check out and the hypotheses check out in repeatable, predictable ways.
Okay. And well, let's go the other way. What do you think would make you less confident that your belief is true? You're a 5. What would make you go to a 4.9? What could you learn?
The belief started out as we are all, right? And I think that is true. And I think that even this conversation has taken me to a point 4.99, right? Because thinking about, I'm naturally second guessing in general, but it's one of those things where with people who are not spiritual, have they been affected? And I believe the answer is yes, because again, we're all connected to someone who is. I feel pretty confident in that.
That we're all connected to somebody who
has experienced
a spiritual trauma.
Yeah, and I think that.
Let me ask you this. You said that in the beginning of the talk, you said that you were at a 5, and then now you're about a 4.99.
Sure.
What dropped your confidence just ever so slightly? What was that thing that you thought about in your mind? Help me understand what that was.
No, yeah, that I can definitely speak to. I think prior to this conversation, like I've said it before earlier, I read a lot, and I am unable, because I am not constantly having conversations like this, to whip out like, here's exactly how I would describe this. And I think it's more of the 0.9 is my inability to articulate how and process, because so which again kind of probably relates to my interpretation and feeling around personal experience, right?
How about this, Ben? Would you be up for a part 2?
Yeah.
Okay.